The second day of the preliminary hearing was expected to answer some important questions. Instead, it raised even more. Inside a Los Angeles courtroom, prosecutors continued laying out evidence they believe supports their case against D4vd, while defense attorneys challenged nearly every detail. Witnesses described financial records, investigators walked through the discovery of evidence, and courtroom observers watched the accused singer with growing curiosity. Yet one of the biggest talking points wasn't testimony at all. It was D4vd's demeanor throughout the proceedings. According to reporters inside the courtroom, he rarely reacted. He sat quietly in his chair, wearing an orange Los Angeles County Jail uniform, his hair noticeably longer than in earlier public appearances, and his face unshaven. He reportedly spoke only a handful of times to his attorneys. Even as emotional testimony unfolded around him, witnesses said there was very little visible expression on his face. That observation became one of the first things discussed after court resumed. The hearing itself is not a trial. At this stage, the judge is deciding whether prosecutors have presented enough evidence for the case to move forward. The standard is much lower than what would eventually be required to convict someone before a jury. Prosecutors only need to establish probable cause, not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Still, every witness matters. Every photograph shown to the courtroom matters. Every answer given under oath matters. That is why both sides approached the hearing with remarkable attention to detail. According to testimony presented in court, D4vd is facing charges connected to the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Prosecutors allege her decomposed and dismembered remains were discovered inside the front trunk of a Tesla reportedly associated with him in September 2025. Those allegations remain the center of the case, and the defense has repeatedly challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. As court resumed, one of the first witnesses to continue testifying was Benjamin Greger, a finance executive associated with D4vd's business operations. His testimony focused on something that, at first glance, might not seem directly connected to a homicide investigation: money. Prosecutors wanted jurors, and eventually the public, to understand how financially successful D4vd had become. According to testimony, millions of dollars were flowing through recording contracts and business agreements. Witnesses described how those earnings were divided among different members of his management and business team. At first, that seemed straightforward, but another detail stood out. During questioning, prosecutors repeatedly referred back to statements Greger had previously made before the grand jury. On several occasions, his testimony in court reportedly differed from those earlier statements. Prosecutors confronted him with transcripts, asking whether what he was saying now matched what he had previously sworn to. The exchanges became noticeably tense. Whenever a witness appears to change details under oath, it naturally attracts attention inside the courtroom. Whether those differences are significant is ultimately for the court to decide, but the questioning highlighted how carefully every word was being examined. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, appeared ready to challenge nearly every conclusion prosecutors attempted to draw. That pattern would continue throughout the hearing. Meanwhile, reporters seated only a few feet behind D4vd observed something else. According to courtroom accounts, he leaned toward his attorneys only occasionally. A yellow legal pad rested in front of him, but observers reported seeing little or no writing on its pages. Instead, he often stared toward the witness stand or the courtroom monitor, displaying exhibits. For people watching from outside the courtroom, those observations became almost as discussed as the testimony itself. Of course, appearances alone cannot reveal what someone is thinking. A person's expression, or lack of one, is not evidence. Still, courtroom observers couldn't help noticing it. As the morning continued, prosecutors shifted away from financial testimony and toward physical evidence. That brought investigators back to the Tesla. According to testimony presented during the hearing, investigators documented numerous air fresheners inside the vehicle. Some were reportedly located in the passenger compartment. Others were found inside the front trunk, where prosecutors allege Celeste's remains had been stored. The number immediately caught attention. Witnesses testified that investigators counted roughly 11 separate air fresheners throughout the vehicle. Prosecutors suggested those items could indicate an effort to mask odors. Defense attorneys, however, continued reminding the court that it would ultimately be up to prosecutors to prove exactly what happened and who was responsible. The testimony became increasingly difficult for those seated in the gallery. Celeste's parents attended portions of the hearing, according to reporters inside the courtroom. During testimony involving photographs recovered during the investigation, observers said they could see the emotional weight on the family as disturbing evidence was discussed. Courtrooms are often quiet places, but silence can sometimes say more than words. As investigators described processing the Tesla after it had been towed to a police facility, photographs documenting the condition of the vehicle were shown to the court. Witnesses explained where evidence was collected, how it was documented, and why investigators believed certain items deserved closer examination. Every photograph became another piece of a much larger puzzle. Every witness added another layer. And while prosecutors continued building their timeline, defense attorneys appeared equally determined to expose any uncertainty they could find. That would become even more apparent as forensic specialists began taking the witness stand. Their testimony would move beyond observations and into science. Blood evidence, DNA analysis, crime scene processing, and the methods investigators used to interpret what they found. Whether those scientific findings ultimately strengthen the prosecution's case or provide opportunities for the defense remains a question that has not yet been answered. That brings us to the next stage of the hearing, where forensic evidence would begin taking center stage, and both sides would engage in some of the most detailed exchanges of the proceedings so far. The courtroom had already heard testimony about finances and the discovery of evidence inside the Tesla. But as the hearing moved forward, prosecutors called witnesses, whose job was not to speculate or offer opinions. Their role was to explain exactly what investigators found, how they documented it, and what the evidence could and could not prove. That brought the focus to the forensic team. One of the first criminalists to testify described examining the Tesla after it had been taken to a police facility. According to court testimony, investigators carefully photographed the vehicle, documented every item they located, and collected evidence they believed might help reconstruct what had happened. Among the details discussed were the air fresheners found throughout the vehicle. Prosecutors argued that their locations inside both the passenger compartment and the front trunk were significant. Defense attorneys did not dispute that the air fresheners were present. Instead, they continued pressing witnesses on whether investigators could definitively connect those items to any criminal act or identify who had placed them there. Then the testimony shifted to something investigators considered even more important: the garage at D4vd's residence. According to one lapped criminalist, investigators processed numerous items recovered there, including floor mats, trash bags, tools, and possible biological evidence. One area received particular attention during questioning. Beneath black rubber floor mats in the garage, investigators reported identifying what appeared to be blood staining on the brick flooring underneath. Prosecutors suggested this supported their timeline of events. The defense, however, immediately began examining how those conclusions had been reached. Rather than accepting the findings at face value, defense attorneys questioned every step of the forensic process. How was the scene documented? What testing was performed? What testing was not performed? Could something have been missed? Those questions became the rhythm of the afternoon. At first, the exchanges sounded highly technical, but as they continued, it became clear why the defense was focusing so heavily on procedure. If investigators overlooked evidence, failed to collect certain items, or chose not to perform additional testing, those decisions could become important later if the case proceeds to trial. One topic that generated considerable discussion involved several chainsaws recovered during the search. According to testimony, investigators located 2 chainsaws inside the garage. The criminalist explained that initial testing did not reveal indications of blood that investigators believed warranted collecting those tools as evidence. As a result, the chainsaws were not taken for further forensic examination. Defense attorneys immediately challenged that decision. They questioned whether additional testing, including touch DNA analysis, could have produced useful information. Even if visible blood was absent, they suggested other forms of forensic evidence might still have existed. The witness responded that, based on what investigators observed during their examination, the chainsaws did not appear to have forensic value at that time. It was another example of 2 sides looking at the same facts through very different lenses. For prosecutors, the investigation appeared thorough. For the defense, unanswered questions remained. Then, another witness added an entirely different piece to the puzzle. A California Highway Patrol officer testified about personal belongings connected to Celeste. According to testimony presented during the hearing, her passport identification card was eventually located months after investigators discovered her remains. Prosecutors introduced that evidence as part of the broader timeline they were building. Each witness added another date, another location, another small detail. Standing alone, none of those pieces necessarily told the whole story. Together, prosecutors hoped they would. But perhaps the most anticipated testimony of the day came from DNA specialists. When the forensic scientist took the stand, the courtroom shifted into an even more detailed discussion of laboratory analysis. The witness explained how DNA samples were collected, tested, and compared. According to her testimony, several samples produced statistical probabilities so high that the likelihood of the DNA belonging to someone other than Celeste was extraordinarily small. Those numbers sounded compelling, yet the defense was prepared. Rather than challenging the mathematics itself, defense attorneys questioned something else entirely. What exactly was the source of the DNA? Was it definitely blood? Could it have come from skin cells, hair, simple contact? The criminalist acknowledged that DNA testing identifies genetic material, but determining precisely how that material arrived at a particular location can sometimes require additional interpretation. That answer opened the door to one of the defense's recurring themes: transfer. Defense attorneys introduced the concept of secondary and tertiary DNA transfer. Using simple examples, they suggested that DNA could potentially move from one surface to another through ordinary contact. If one person touched another person's hand, and that second person touched an object, could DNA eventually appear somewhere unexpected? The witness agreed that such transfer is scientifically possible under certain circumstances. That did not invalidate the DNA evidence presented by prosecutors, but it demonstrated why juries often hear lengthy testimony from forensic experts. Scientific evidence can be powerful, yet it also requires careful explanation. As the afternoon continued, the hearing moved steadily from one exhibit to another: photographs, laboratory reports, evidence logs, chain of custody records. Every document was examined with remarkable precision. Meanwhile, D4vd reportedly remained largely expressionless at the defense table. Reporters inside the courtroom observed few visible reactions, even during detailed discussions of forensic findings. Whether that reflected emotion, strategy, or simply the stress of lengthy court proceedings remains unknown. By the time court recessed, prosecutors had introduced some of their strongest forensic evidence so far. But the defense had also accomplished something important. Rather than allowing the evidence to stand uncontested, they had highlighted areas they believed deserved closer scrutiny. They questioned investigative decisions, challenged assumptions, and reminded the court that forensic science sometimes leaves room for competing interpretations. The next witness would take the hearing into even more difficult territory. The deputy medical examiner who performed Celeste's autopsy was preparing to testify. His findings would address the injuries, the condition of the remains, and the medical conclusions that prosecutors believe support the homicide charge. It would become one of the most emotional portions of the entire hearing. When court resumed, everyone knew this testimony would be different. Up to that point, the hearing had focused on financial records, investigators, and forensic analysts. Now, the court was preparing to hear from the deputy medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Celeste Rivas Hernandez. Before testimony even began, there was an unexpected moment inside the courtroom. According to reporters who were present, the courtroom monitor briefly displayed several autopsy photographs before they were meant to appear as evidence. Witnesses later described hearing audible gasps from people seated in the gallery as the images flashed across the screen. The reaction was immediate. For many observers, it was a stark reminder that behind every exhibit, every report, and every legal argument was the death of a 14-year-old girl. Celeste's parents reportedly chose not to remain in the courtroom for much of this testimony. Given the nature of the evidence that was about to be discussed, many people understood why. Unlike investigators, the deputy medical examiner approached the testimony with clinical precision. His role was not to assign blame or speculate about motives. He was there to explain what he observed during the autopsy and what conclusions his office was able to reach. According to his testimony, the official manner of death was ruled a homicide. The cause of death, he explained, involved multiple penetrating injuries. That much had already been made public, but as questioning continued, another important detail emerged. The medical examiner testified that because of the advanced state of decomposition, he could not definitively identify the specific weapon responsible for those injuries. While prosecutors allege that a sharp instrument was used, the witness explained that the condition of the remains prevented him from stating that conclusion with complete certainty. That testimony immediately became a focal point for the defense. Defense attorneys carefully questioned the medical examiner about what he could say with confidence and what he could not. Could he determine which wound happened first? No. Could he determine exactly how much time passed between the injuries? No. Could he identify the precise weapon? No. Could he state with certainty how long Celeste survived after receiving those injuries? Again, he could not. None of those answers changed the medical examiner's conclusion that the death had been ruled a homicide. But they demonstrated the limits of forensic medicine when a body has undergone significant decomposition. The defense then explored another line of questioning that drew noticeable reactions inside the courtroom. Attorneys asked whether the medical examiner could completely rule out every possible alternative explanation for the injuries, based solely on the autopsy findings. His answer reflected the limitations of the examination itself. He explained that certain possibilities could not be excluded based only on the physical evidence available to him. According to courtroom observers, that exchange prompted raised eyebrows among several people seated in the gallery. Whether those questions ultimately influence a jury, if the case reaches trial, remains to be seen. Another important issue involved the alleged murder weapon. Throughout several days of testimony, prosecutors introduced evidence recovered from D4vd's residence, including chainsaws found during the search. Yet the medical examiner testified that he could not identify the exact tool used to dismember the remains. He explained that different instruments can produce different types of injuries, but based on the evidence available, he could not definitively connect the injuries to any one specific tool. That left another unanswered question in the case. If prosecutors believe a particular weapon was used, will additional evidence eventually establish that connection? Or will the defense argue that the uncertainty creates reasonable doubt? Those are questions that would likely become much more significant if the case proceeds to trial. The hearing also returned briefly to the condition of the remains when they were examined. The medical examiner described advanced decomposition and insect activity that had developed before the autopsy. He also testified that dental records ultimately played a key role in confirming Celeste's identity, because visual identification was no longer possible. It was quiet inside the courtroom as those details were discussed. Some testimony does not require dramatic language. The facts speak for themselves. By the end of the hearing, prosecutors had presented testimony from investigators, financial witnesses, forensic specialists, DNA analysts, and the deputy medical examiner. Piece by piece, they outlined the evidence they believe establishes probable cause for the case to continue. The defense, however, pursued a different strategy. Rather than attempting to explain every allegation, defense attorneys consistently focused on uncertainty. They questioned witness recollections. They challenged forensic procedures. They examined scientific limitations. And they highlighted every point where an expert acknowledged that something could not be stated with complete certainty. That approach is common during preliminary hearings, where both sides begin revealing the arguments they may rely on if the case eventually reaches a jury. What happens next now rests with the court. The judge must decide whether prosecutors have presented sufficient evidence for the charges to move forward. If the answer is yes, the case will advance toward trial, where the burden of proof will become much higher. Witnesses will likely return to testify, and both sides will present their cases before a jury. For now, many important questions remain unanswered. How will the defense explain the evidence presented so far? Will prosecutors introduce additional witnesses or forensic findings before trial? And how will a future jury evaluate testimony that combines scientific evidence, eyewitness observations, and competing interpretations of the same facts? As this case continues to develop, each court appearance is likely to provide new information, new legal arguments, and new questions that investigators, attorneys, and the public will continue to examine. What are your thoughts on the testimony presented so far? Do you think the preliminary hearing has answered more questions than it raised, or are there still major gaps that need to be explained? If you found this update helpful and would like to follow future developments in the case, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next report. Thanks for watching, and we'll continue bringing you the latest verified courtroom updates as they become available.